Welcome to Political Fictions, a podcast that's scrawling abstract nouns with a Sharpie on an office wall whilst listing the names of famous authors. My name is Corey Hazelhurst, and I'm visibly struggling to hide my contempt for Mark Pack. Hello, Mark.
Corey, listeners may have guessed that Corey didn't quite get the opening line right the first 7 times he tried it.
Practice is perfect, so they say. Speaking of which, referendums. This week, we're marking 10 years since the Brexit referendum, and we watched Brexit, the Uncivil War. So just give us a second to reinflate our Stronger In branded balloons, and then we'll pop up after this jolly theme tune. So first item on the agenda, Mark. Events, dear boy. Neither of us have seen this before, so this is the first episode in which we both went in cold.
I have been staying in my Chilean referendum comfort zone. For people who heard our episode about the Chilean referendum and the excellent film No will understand why I feel that is a much happier story than the Brexit one. I have mixed feelings about being forced to think about the Brexit referendum campaign in such detail for this episode.
Well, like Morgan McSweeney and Tony Blair, Mark, I'm glad to have dragged you kicking and screaming out of your comfort zone into a more mainstream political fiction. I hadn't seen it. I remember thinking it was all a bit too soon to watch it. I remember the publicity campaign about it. I remember some of the interviews about Benedict Cumberbatch's performance as Dominic Cummings, which obviously we'll talk about. We are recording this in the week in which Wes Streeting has resigned as a cabinet minister in the wake of disastrous local election results, and it's just been announced that Andy Burnham's running in Makerfield. So watching this on the Monday of that week felt like going back in time to a very Brexit vibe, where you're like, oh, well, this is an hour and a half. Is the Prime Minister still going to be the same Prime Minister an hour and a half later?
It's also, I think, a TV film that has aged in quite odd ways. I mean, Brexit is still very much a big part of British politics, so it feels like quite a contemporary film. The way Dominic Cummings' public persona has evolved since it means that the respects in which, in some ways, at the time, people might have felt this was an overblown weirdness of his character, actually seems quite moderate compared to the 30,000 word Substack email writing, lecturing all of Westminster on not understanding Bismarck person that Dominic Cummings has either evolved into or is more clearly, perhaps that's what he always was. But, it feels like it fits the current Dominic Cummings image really well. But then in other respects, it sort of aged a little bit poorly. Like the whole premise of the opening scene is that nobody knows who Dominic Cummings is, which I guess at the time the film came out will have been just about true, because it would have come out, I think, just before he was appointed by Boris Johnson as his sort of top political advisor in Downing Street. So even people who are quite into politics wouldn't necessarily have been that aware of him at the time this came out. And then obviously that has very much changed since. He has become the most famous person to drive a car in many ways in the last 10 years in Britain.
And I realise one thing we're going to have to be very, very careful of is not being too snotty about people who write very long Substack newsletters, because
you're safe. I think yours are almost always shorter than mine, so you're safe from that. But you're right. But this is one of the interesting things about it, isn't it? Is although the lead actor, and as much as we can divine it, the author of the screenplay, I think both, I would say I'm 95% sure that both voted Remain. It doesn't feel like it's a particularly Remainy film. And I think people who voted Leave will not necessarily watch it and think it's a particularly Leave film. It is quite balanced, which is to its credit, given the difficulty of the topic. And it doesn't achieve that balance by being insipid and bland.
Yeah, so it came out in 2019, so I'm assuming it was probably filmed in the year or two before that. So and at the time, I don't think Dominic Cummings wasn't even thought of being made chief of staff. And so, yeah, I think you're right. It's an interesting decision to put Cummings at the centre of the story. I think for reasons that you've said, it has meant it's a bit more dated. I mean, the framing device of it is that Dominic Cummings, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, is at an inquiry into the sort of the Information Commissioner inquiry, isn't it? Into various.
I would if Information Commissioner inquiries were really like that, life would be so much more fun. I mean, I, for example, once took Tony Blair successfully to the Information Commissioner and, got a complaint upheld. But it's not like, I mean, that would have been huge fun if, you turn up and you're sat in this room with Tony Blair, and all of the people. it's much more boring. You send a couple of emails, and 9 months later, you get a very terse message back. It's the reality of how an awful lot of this works. But you're right. But I think without jumping ahead into too many of the other categories into too chaotic a way, the framing around the backroom person is similar to This House, which is the play that we've discussed on an earlier episode of this podcast, and This House and Brexit Uncivil War have the same creative genius behind them. And I'm sure that's not a coincidence that this is somebody who I won't name because I'm not going to ruin your next category. But this is somebody who understands that there's an interesting story to tell by looking at the people behind the scenes.
Using Dominic Cummings as a framing device, you can completely see why, and we'll go into why. I suppose the problem is, in terms of how it's dated curiously, is that this is a little bit like if This House was released in 1981 and the framing character, and obviously Bob Mellish, who's the Labour chief whip in the Wilson government, is a bit of a hero of that. But it's a bit like if we were both Benite members of the Bermondsey Labour Party watching This House, where Bob Mellish is the hero, if that isn't too obscure a reference. Brexit, the Uncivil War, it charts the Brexit referendum campaign through the top staffers and politicians in both the Leave and the Remain campaigns. It focuses mainly on Dominic Cummings, as we said, is played by Benedict Cumberbatch, and particularly focuses on his use of data-driven online algorithms to target voters on Facebook, get them to vote. The second item on the agenda, All the President's Men, cast and crew, and this is written by James Graham of This House and many other very good and indeed excellent plays. Directed by Toby Haynes, who IMDb tells me has done lots of good niche telly, Being Human, Black Mirror and Sherlock are the three that I picked out.
He did the BBC version of Sherlock Holmes. The reason I went ooh is there is one scene in particular which really made me think this feels so like the BBC modern Sherlock Holmes. So the scene in which I really want to call him Dominic Cumberbatch, Benedict Cumberbatch.
Just go with it, Mark.
Is looking around the park at all sorts of different people with different activities where they're creating and uploading data to the internet, like a fitness tracker and social media and email and all that. People who that scene when he's really felt like one of those Sherlock Holmes scenes where Sherlock Holmes is looking around and there's the one thing that was missing was all the little bits of text graphic popping up. So I suspect it's even less of a coincidence than I thought that at some points this feels very much like the Sherlock Holmes directorial style, because same director.
It's quite a big ensemble cast of characters, isn't it? So David Cameron's off stage, though you hear his voice.
Very much like James Graham's This House, where the political party leaders of the time don't really feature. They're essentially off stage as well.
It's a bit of a mixed bag, I have to say. So Benedict Cumberbatch is very, very good at Dominic Cummings.
And interestingly, Dominic Cummings' wife was very complimentary about how well Benedict Cumberbatch adapted the character and the mannerisms of a husband, and even has a little story to tell about how their child got fooled. I don't quite understand in what how the child ends up being fooled, because they can't have seen enough of the person, surely, or was the child extremely... But anyway, if the wife of the person you're portraying says my child is fooled by this, I think that's a pretty good mark in favour of the quality of his acting.
Yeah, so I remember reading at the time that she thought the portrayal was particularly good. This sounds like a backhanded compliment, and I suppose in a way it is, that generally the actors are better in the characters you don't know so well. So the only thing I've seen about Dominic Cummings is his press conference after Barnard Castle bit. Rory Kinnear, I think, is very good as Craig Oliver, but I couldn't really tell you. I don't think I've ever seen Craig Oliver being interviewed. The actor playing Nigel Farage, who confusingly is called Paul Ryan, but it's not that Paul Ryan. It's not Mitt Romney's vice presidential candidate. Although I would watch that. He doesn't quite have the look, does he? But he's got the kind of Nigel Farage guffaw, his kind of exaggerated laughing, and a bit of a stop-start staccato interview technique. So there's definitely a bit of the essence of Mr. Farage there. Richard Goulding is a naval attaché in the Iron Lady, apparently. A rather niche callback to one of our earlier episodes. He's Boris Johnson, and honestly is a bit too young for the part. He looks like a kid in a school play who's playing the part of Boris Johnson.
I think that works really well because, as you say, he very much looks like somebody who has had the right blonde hairstyle stuck on top of his head, so you know it's Boris Johnson. And other than that, doesn't really look like Boris Johnson. But he gets the mannerisms so brilliantly. And I actually found it easier to engage with and enjoy that than some of the other characters who physically look much more similar to the people they're portraying. But I felt get caught in this uncanny valley of not being quite close enough for it to work, but not quite different enough for me to be able to concentrate on, oh, well, they're getting the mannerisms brilliantly, or the words are great, or whatever. So for a lot of it, it felt just all a bit off key and slightly wrong to me. And it was only when I twigged, hang on a minute, it's because like the Bernard Jenkins character looks so much like Bernard Jenkins, but not quite. It all feels a bit. Likewise, the Craig Oliver. Yeah, I was briefly a work colleague of Craig, so yeah, I know what he looks like. I guess a little bit better than you do. And again, it's sort of, oh, is that? Oh no, that's not quite it. And so yeah, I felt they got trapped in this uncanny valley, and therefore the Boris Johnson character works all the better because it so obviously isn't Boris.
Richard Goulding definitely gets the Richard E. Grant hair rubbing category. For the thrusting arms, he does get those. Chap playing Michael Gove, I just think is like the face is wrong, the voice is wrong, the voice is far too nasal,
and also it's the wrong. I mean, I don't know Michael Gove at all, other than as it were by reputation. I've seen him a couple of times briefly in the House of Lords since he joined the House of Lords, and it feels to me like the tone of the Michael Gove in the film is sort of the slightly nerdy, he's quite a nerdy person, not that much, not a physically imposing presence. While the real Michael Gove, is much more the sort of person you can imagine striding into the room and being the centre of attention. And
also sort of unfailingly polite and unflappable rather than a bit whiny and nasal.
Yeah, although given his interventions in the Lords, I would. I'm not sure I've got. But you're
okay.
Right. There is definitely something about what is certainly true about Michael Gove. Obviously, a very controversial character in many respects. Is I know several people who at some point have had a confrontation with him and then had a drink or a coffee, and they're quite friendly. There is a certain, you're right, sort of classic, almost apolitical charm that he can deploy at times.
I always like having an obscure Birmingham reference in my podcasts. One of the characters portrayed is Gisela Stewart, who at the time was MP for Birmingham Edgbaston, was part of the Vote Leave campaign. I think was probably the most senior Labour figure, where there's a bit of a West Wing walk and talk style, and it's Johnson, Stewart and Gove with Dominic Cummings. And there's a bit where Gisela Stewart sort of half-heartedly raises her hand to try and make a contribution while Dominic Cummings is giving them the benefit of his genius. I checked with people who I know in Birmingham Labour circles who know Gisela, and one of them said, that is the least Gisela thing I can ever imagine happening. Really? Yeah.
Does Gisela Stewart have any connection with Montessori schools?
I don't know.
Which, this may seem a weird question to ask. The reason I ask is I think there is something that is particularly taught in Montessori schools, where if a child wants the teacher's attention, that they will often put their hand on the teacher's shoulder or touch, or their hand on the arm. It's a sort of polite indicating that you want their attention without being demanding, and sort of therefore learning a little bit patience and respect, but also being. And I just wonder, it feels like the Gisela Stewart of this drama is doing the adult version of that. And so I wondered if that was where maybe James Graham had got the inspiration for that from.
Having been a member of Edgbaston Constitutional Party while Gisela was still the MP, that's not quite the impression that Gisela generally gave. Let's give that.
Okay. So she just got the short end of the stick when it came to characters having to be changed for dramatic purposes.
I suppose partly it is because she isn't really a household figure.
I think quite a lot of writers take that view, don't they, when they're sort of fictionalizing stuff. And I always feel a bit sorry for the less famous person, because for the less famous person, the depiction may be the only thing the audience know about them. Whilst if you've got, say, Boris Johnson in some way being misrepresented, people know loads about him anyway. It's not like you're casting the verdict and setting the way in which loads of people will know somebody.
So I feel like the impression that you get from a lot of the accounts of the Leave campaign is essentially she's there to give some spurious cross-party support to the Johnson and Gove show, which I think massively undersells her as a politician. I mean, very, very brief diversion on Birmingham electoral politics. Like in the 2010 election, when Labour was completely doomed, Birmingham Edgbaston was one of the top Tory targets in the whole country. Gisela had won. Strength of her personal vote, strength of the Edgbaston campaigning machine that was there. Yeah, she was a pretty formidable personality. She's not really part of this Brexit story, really. And yeah, I mean, that's literally the only scene that she's in. This is the story of Dominic Cummings, the all-knowing genius, right? And Gisela Stewart is very much room meat in this film in a way that she'd never really been in any meeting she was actually in.
I wonder, though, also if there's a reflection of the two political consultants on the film. I think are Tim Shipman and Craig Oliver, aren't they? Who are both, I think it's probably fair to say, Westminster and London-centric people. You know, and so in a way, the film reflects that London-centric sort of perspective that is obviously very relevant to the topic, but tends to be a bit too dominant in British politics. And, you know, there's not quite the respect for local government that there will be in future when possibly by the time people are listening to this, a former mayor of Greater Manchester has become Prime Minister.
We need to get our obligatory Peter Mandelson reference in.
Oh, yes, of course.
Because obviously Mark Gatiss does pop up as the voice of Peter Mandelson. So you don't see Peter Mandelson.
Done so well. I mean, particularly up since the Epstein revelations, the sort of dark tone of Mark Gatiss's impersonation of Mandelson works really well. If you were to just watch that scene and knew nothing about British politics and to be told one of these is somebody who's had to resign 3 times in scandal, one of which involves a paedophile, you'd guess that, oh, it's the person that Mark Gatiss voiced, isn't it?
I think it should be shown to drama students and aspiring actors to say, if you want to answer the question, is it possible to choose scenery when we can't see you on screen? Mark Gatiss manages it. We should go to the next category, art of the possible, because you've mentioned this is based on 2 books, which are All Out War by Tim Shipman and Unleashing Demons by Craig Oliver. And they came out probably 12 to 18 months, I think, after the vote. Both quite big sellers. I've only read All Out War. I haven't read Unleashing Demons. The fact that they're consultants is reflected at the start of the film, in which it says, this drama is based on real events and statements with key people who were there. Some aspects of dialogue, character and scenes have been devised for the purposes of dramatisation. I mean, basically, this is the William of Malmesbury School of History. William of Malmesbury, for those who haven't had the pleasure, 12th century chronicler, wrote a lot about England in the Middle Ages. Lots of it is basically invented conversations about King Henry said this to Thomas Becket and then Prince John said this in reply. And it's about getting the truthiness of what happened. It's almost like first draft of history journalism stuff, isn't it? And it's really good. William of Malmesbury was great. All Out War is a really good book. I suppose the downside of this kind of account is not only is it a bit Westminster focused, it also ignores a lot of structural issues and factors in the vote, which maybe 10 years on we can think about a little bit more.
I mean, one of the other respects in which it is based on reality is there's lots of interleaving of real TV footage into it, which is done in a much smoother and more natural way than you often see. What I think it feels like as well is that it is written by somebody who is a playwright, which, you know, it is. And I say that because if you were writing a novel or maybe doing a film from scratch, it feels like you would probably have another strand of story that you would cut between now and again that is maybe, you know, a couple who are living in a bungalow in northern England. You know, there's a whole set of that, the politics well outside London of, you know, imagine a owner-occupier in a bungalow near, say, Darlington. That's one of the key stories behind how the Brexit side won. It's one of the key stories that you get told if you're reading a book by a political scientist or a pollster about Brexit, and is almost completely absent from this film, because in a way this film is just about the scenes that you can have on your London stage set. And I think in that sense, you also see the sort of theatrical tenor of it in this slightly odd Dominic Cummings, Craig Oliver made up scene of having a drink in a pub together. And again, you can see why, for dramatic purposes, that has been created as a way of juxtaposing two different sides and so on. Although I do think that's one of the relatively few occasions when watching it where I thought just the acting and the screenwriting is not quite up to this moment. It's no De Niro and Pacino in Heat, or Brando and Pacino in The Godfather. You think of those classic head-to-head scenes, it just doesn't quite come off, I think.
What it reminded me of was the scene in Frost Nixon in which Richard Nixon, which we should do, in which Richard Nixon drunkenly telephones David Frost, which I think again is one of those conversations that never took place.
As I recall, when I sort of have watched and seen and read multiple Frost Nixon stuff, that bit of fiction is quite plausible because there were lots of Frost Nixon conversations, albeit not of that not that particular one, in a way that I think I don't think Cummings and Oliver have had many sort of one-to-one conversations.
No, it felt a bit more like the Mary Queen of Scots version with Margot Robbie, in which Saoirse Ronan, as Mary Queen of Scots, meets Margot Robbie's Elizabeth, even though they never met in real life. Maybe Craig Oliver and Dominic Cummings have gone for a pun, but yeah, it did feel a little bit contrived and like you don't need it. There's a scene in which someone, I think, has a Vote Leave poster on their window, and they're staring at someone through the window and basically give them the finger, which I suppose it's a bit of a clunky way of saying Britain got a bit divided and was, by all this. And you think, well, that's not really quite how it played out. Even I was having conversations with Leave voting relatives or friends. It was never like, but also just. If I've got a Labour poster in my window and I give someone the finger, that's not necessarily the greatest ambassadorial role for the Labour Party I will ever play. So it just all felt a bit weird.
Although you would still be doing a better job at appearing like a respectable member of the Labour Party than Peter Mandelson has. So,
it's a low bar, Mark. It really is.
But I would love to hear, say, James Graham or, talk about some of these choices more, because obviously he is massively more successful at understanding how to write a good play or a good TV drama than me. So one has to respect that some of the things that puzzle me, there may be a really good reason for that I'm just failing to understand. And I particularly thought that when we got to the origin of the Take Back Control slogan, because I think the real story about how it originates in what people say in focus groups is something that's filmable and is really good in that it roots the story and the campaign in the public out there. And instead we get this, to me, slightly weird made up version of Dominic Cummings reading a book about parenting and getting the inspiration from that to come up with Take Back Control. And I couldn't quite see why that had to be fictionalized rather than the show reflecting reality.
It's really strange, isn't it? Because one of the things this does is try and present Dominic Cummings as that eccentric genius who just had these flashes of inspiration. I suppose one of the other things it's trying to say is that maybe the Remain campaign was too focus group driven. Because, there's a weird scene where Dominic Cummings says, Benedict Cumberbatch playing Dominic Cummings says, we don't need focus groups, and then goes and interviews people in pubs instead. And I think almost it's maybe trying to make the point that this is one man's gut intuition against the kind of Westminster consensus of using focus groups.
Why have the parenting book? Why not have Dominic Cummings continue to sit in that really weird cupboard, which I've got a lot to say about when we get to that category? But as I said, James Graham clearly knows far more about how to do this stuff well than me. So I'm just curious. I found that curious. The other thing, though, that I think to flip round to praising him, where he clearly fictionalizes something, but in a way that works really well, is when Craig Oliver is watching a focus group and gets so irate about what the people in the focus group are saying and how wrong they are that he storms in and starts taking part in the focus group and trying to lecture. Now, as far as I'm aware, that is completely fictional. Craig Oliver, far too professional to do that. But also it's true that I think almost anyone who has done a lot of political focus groups has their own little after dinner story about the politician who was outraged and thought they cannot, where have you found these people, or I want to go in and lecture. Yeah. So although I think it's a fake event, it emotionally, it's true that is how a lot of people react to focus groups. And it's also how a lot of Remain campaigners were reacting to the public. So that bit of fiction I get, even though the baby book I don't get.
That's really interesting because when I watched that scene, I thought there is no way that this happens. And maybe once again, I'm overestimating the ability of politicians to sit and listen rather than speak.
Yeah. So very central to the story that we get told here about Brexit is the role of a Canadian data company, not Cambridge Analytica, but a Canadian company, Aggregate IQ, also known as AIQ. And the story we're told here is that AIQ were brought in by Dominic Cummings, were absolutely brilliant set of people who ran a really intensive, clever digital campaign to target millions of traditional non-voters and get them out to vote. There's certainly some truth in that, but I think there is a big question mark about how true it is, and the way that this film sort of slightly merges some of the Cambridge Analytica sort of more conspiratorial stuff into the story without quite going fully down the Cambridge Analytica route. And, the text messages on screen at the end that sort of are meant to tell you what happens in real life subsequent to the events in the film. Talk about Cambridge Analytica, link them with AIQ through a big Donald Trump supporter called Robert Mercer. You're meant to sort of feel like there is some sort of potentially dodgy conspiracy involving American money, online data, breaking the rules, hence the ICO framing, all of it. When I think it's fair to say the more dispassionate analysis now is that although there was a huge scandal involving Cambridge Analytica, it's very questionable how effective their tools actually were. We still don't really know for sure what their involvement was in the Brexit referendum campaign or not. But the sort of Carol Cadwalla post-Brexit, blame this all on a conspiracy of dodgy foreign money and dodgy data, that story hasn't really held up that well. And I think this drama does perhaps give that tee you up to believe rather more of the story than I think a dispassionate reading of the evidence would now say.
I think so. I think we should talk about maybe Facebook campaigning itself more in other categories. But yeah, my impression on this specifically is that a lot of this is companies who are trying to exaggerate their impact so that people will hire them to do more campaigning. And therefore the role is quite overblown. Whereas, as I say, what I think are more likely to be at play here are those big structural factors which are necessarily ignored. I'm not having a go at Tim Shipman and Craig Oliver for this because that's not the book they've written. But when you think about why is it that Britain voted to leave, looking at it with a bit of hindsight, you think actually, well, austerity was a massive factor. The fact that Leave voters, the Leave vote was higher in areas of austerity, and actually that's also sort of turbocharged the Reform vote now. But that's not really something that either Craig Oliver, working in Downing Street at the time, or Conservative politicians who are talking to Tim Shipman are necessarily going to highlight. And admittedly, a lot of that is probably based on academic evidence post-referendum. But nevertheless, if you're looking at the story of that, what the film does do pretty well is capture the ambiguous relationship that Britain with Europe have had since 1945 in some archive footage in a minute. And there is a throwaway line in the film about, I think the Craig Oliver character says, this has been a campaign they've been working towards for 20 years. So it does, I think, talk about that sort of natural Euroscepticism.
Yeah, I guess the best illustration of your point is that if you were to read the book Brexit Land, which is probably the best political science book that's come out, trying to explain the Brexit referendum by Rob Ford and Maria Sobolewska, if you're to read that and you to watch this film, there's not that much overlap between the stories the two tell. There is some, but there's not that much. And I think just coming back to the sort of Cambridge Analytica AIQ thing, one of the things that doesn't get featured at all in this drama is the digital campaign of the Stronger Inside, which was run by the people who had run the digital campaign for the David Cameron Conservative Party 2015 general election campaign. Surprise victory, hugely lauded. Oh, this amazingly clever, digital campaign machine. then gets deployed again. Sadly, from my point of view, they get it the wrong way round. Uh, they're brilliant for getting the Tories re-elected, and then they don't win the referendum. If only they'd done it the other way round. But what that illustrates is so often the massively lauded, super clever, niche, maybe semi-secret digital campaign that wins, and you have all of this stuff about it, then gets deployed again and loses. We saw it actually with Trump. The first Trump presidential election victory, lots of hype about the digital campaign around that. Deployed again 4 years later, he lost. And indeed, when he came back to win again, it's not like it was a revival of that digital stuff. He had moved, So I think there's, as we, this demonstrates, there's a very strong dramatic pull of the super secret boffins doing clever stuff that has got some dodgy connections about it as well. But that's got a real dramatic power to it. But often when you then have a look at the evidence and have the chance to look at the evidence with a few years hindsight,
The other thing that's in the film is this idea that the Leave campaign was aided by the fact you had these two campaigns, that you had the Cummings-led Vote Leave, which gets the official designation, and there's the Nigel Farage, Aaron Banks, Leave.eu. And again, this is a big part of All Out War. It's a big part of the bad boys of Brexit. There's been some talk about how essentially it allows, you can have your cake and eat it, essentially, can't you? You've got Gove and Johnson as your respectable establishment cabinet ministers, and you've got Farage and Banks with a more populist anti-immigration message. And actually, one of the structural things that probably helped, that wasn't really talked about much at the time, is the fact that immigration was a massively salient issue because of the crisis in Syria and the kind of refugee the huge amount of refugees who were coming into Europe, which was peaking at about the time when Brexit's happening. So again, it's one of those things that isn't talked about, but had the referendum been a year later, that might not be a salient issue. Again, this was a quite close campaign, 52-48 Leave. If it was 52-48 the other way, you can absolutely imagine, given that all the stuff that's in the film and in Tim Shipman's book, the post-mortem would have been completely chaotic, divided Leave campaign. Leave would definitely have won had they just unified around one vehicle.
Exactly, yeah.
But we've got often in campaigns there's such an outcome bias, in the same way that because Labour won a by-election in Batley and Spen by 250 votes, Keir Starmer wasn't challenged as leader, whereas if he'd have lost by 250 votes, he would have been. And you think, well, this is just madness, really.
I don't know if Professor Phil Cowley is a listener of ours, but he would be so proud of you for making that point.
We can't beat Professor Phil Cowley. We should move on then, shouldn't we?
Yeah. So, what is one thing better than Phil Cowley? Barack Obama's tan suit.
Best and worst bits of political detail. Should we do the good stuff first?
The jumper. Anyone who is particularly familiar with the history of Britain's relations with Europe, and especially the first referendum on our membership of what is now the European Union in the 1970s, we'll know that there's a famous photo which features in this drama as well of Margaret Thatcher in a jumper showing the flags of all of the different members of the European Economic Community as it was back then. And it's just fabulous. I love that photo because it is so incongruous given what happened subsequently in British politics.
And will be in every single history of Britain and Europe from now till the year 4000.
Absolutely. Yeah. I thought one of the other bits of detail which I really liked, which I don't know if it's genuine or not, but there's at one point Craig Oliver is trying to be on a conference phone call with the Prime Minister and the aforementioned excellent Peter Mandelson impersonator, Mark Gatiss. He's dialing in from home to this high-powered political telephone conference call, and he's trying to get his kids, I think it's kids and a friend of his kids, eating their fish fingers and peas. He's trying to control the children. The peas end up everywhere and all of that sort of... And it just reminded me of, for example, the story that Ed Balls told when he was on the TV panel comedy show Would I Lie to You, about him negotiating the budget for the police while crawling through a children's ball pit playground. And so I don't know whether that Craig Oliver incident is actually true, but even if it isn't, it epitomizes something that a lot of people in politics will recognize about this difficulty of balancing home life and your job.
It's probably the nearest that this film gets to something that could be in the thick of it.
Yes.
I think it's that kind of farcical black comedy.
Yeah. The bit of detail though that I loved the most was the empty office that the Leave campaign initially hire, and you've got the characters walking into it. And there's just something about the dressing of that stage set, like this slightly random half-open box in the middle of the floor, which just, I don't know what it is. That's just what offices like that are when you first take occupation of them.
It reminded me of a by-election campaign.
Yeah,
where,
it really felt like this is the by-election office that you've just hired,
yeah,
you've just walked into. Yeah, it's just so well done, that stage setting. So certainly a lot of the details really work nicely, including also, yeah, as ever with these things, not all of the scenes that took place in famous locations can be filmed actually at that location, but generally there's quite a lot of good use of the London backdrop. I don't think Dominic Cummings sort of stood to ponder and look out across the Thames on the bridge that is the bridge used in this drama, but it is a very plausible bridge for that story. So it feels like a lot of the detail is done very well.
a lot of it is. However, we'll start. Worst detail is that contrived returning officer message, where everyone.
I'd love to just ask James Graham, what were you doing? What were you thinking?
I think it was
the real drama of election counts over an extended period of time is surely better material than the.
But I assume they've just done it for Americans. A bit like we've in the Iron Lady and actually this took place at Manchester Town Hall, didn't it? So again, a bit of a random Iron Lady callback. For those who haven't seen it, essentially what they do is rather than have the tension of, oh, the returns look bad from Sunderland, they have this fiction that somehow everyone is waiting for the returning officer from Manchester to read out the final result of 17.9 million for Leave and 16 million for Remain. Cue massive celebration. I think it sort of mimics what you see at the end of on election night, when you'll have Mark Pack 4,803, and everyone will go into rapturous applause. Yeah. But that just didn't happen because obviously it was obvious that Leave had already. Well, so it was massively contrived, and I didn't like it. The most disgusting piece of political detail was one of the most shambolic door-knocking encounters I've ever seen.
I would object to the fact that you're going to go on a 3-hour rant were it not for the fact that a reasonable proportion of my 3-hour rant in the All the President's Men episode comparing Watergate with Indiana Jones you kindly left in. So, okay, take it away.
They go to Clacton.
Stick my feet up, push my chair back.
So they go to Clacton, and there is a quite nice line, isn't there? Like, I don't know this place. It's like, it's in your constituency, Douglas, and it has been for years. And I suppose the idea is that I assume the boffins at Aggregate Q or whoever it is have said this is where you should be going to knock. There's Matthew Elliott, Dominic Cummings, and Douglas Carswell. 3 people at one doorstep, massive no. Sorry, it's too much like carol singers or Jehovah's Witnesses. You shouldn't knock 3 at a time. They then go into the house of the voter, absolute massive no. They then make the voter cry, which is even worse. Top tip for aspiring politicians: don't make your voters cry. As it turns out, the Labour Party this week is discovering. And finally, Dominic Cummings leaves without saying goodbye. He just gets up and leaves. Bit weird. Nice that, admittedly, literature is left, which is good. But then Dominic Cummings, because he's an eccentric genius, finishes by putting his ear to the road outside their house. However, did they win?
Have you never been reduced to lying on the ground after you come away from a doorstep canvassing somebody?
We're made of sterner stuff in the Labour Party, Mark.
I would say you should have tried canvassing for Labour in Birmingham during the bin strike if that's never happened to you.
I've campaigned then. I've campaigned in 2019. I've got not quite the scars on my back, but the canvassing scene is a weird scene. Definitely one of the things I hope people won't learn from. Yes, we should. Next item on the agenda, go on to the Phil Willis Award. We've mentioned Craig Oliver's bad parenting. We've mentioned Dominic Cummings being the obvious Machiavellian genius of this piece. Yeah, you've mentioned a lot of the kind of conspiracy about weird dark money and Facebook advertising, which probably didn't really make much of a difference. I
mean, I think that is the conspiracy that you're sort of meant to buy into.
I'm also conflating a very British coup, aren't I suppose, but we can maybe do the two categories together.
the sort of idea that dastardly deeds were done with people's personal data and that won the referendum for Brexit is the thought that you're meant to leave with, because the text that comes up on screen at the end, particularly where it talks about the referral to the police crime agency and inquiries ongoing and so on, and the talk about the Donald Trump supporter Robert Mercer, that's all meant to make you think, oh, there's something really substantive to that bit of it. I do wonder whether several years on, if James Graham was making it now, whether he would actually change somewhat the tone of that, given what we know about. Yes, there were various fines, there were various, findings of breaking of the law, but the scale that's being implied in the text on screen at the end of the film, I think, isn't really substantiated by what we now know. Fundamentally, people that I think keen Leave voters would see, or keen Remain voters would see, as the winners of the Phil Willis Award are each other. There is that sort of nature of the very divisive part of it, and perhaps that's captured in that scene, as you say, where somebody's putting up a window poster and sticks their finger up at somebody else who is walking past, that you're maybe meant to think that perhaps the worst people of all of this are actually all of us, for our worst natures being brought out by the contest.
Wow, that's very philosophical. We all win the Phil Willis Award.
We're all winners.
There is an actual coup attempt as well in the narrative where they try and get rid of Dominic Cummings from the board of Vote Leave. It's quite telling because his response is, you didn't secure the state broadcaster and the military, which is a very Dominic Cummings response as how he is portrayed in the film, which leads us on to how to win an election. Best and worst bits of political strategy.
I mean, this in a way is quite straightforward, isn't it? Because the film really zooms in on Dominic Cummings' focus on coming up with a very simple, clear, memorable message that is partly about slogan, but also about how you execute that through all the rest of the campaign. And that is just very straightforwardly very good campaign advice. The other thing that it does, I think, surprisingly well, actually, because it so often is done quite poorly in sort of dramas and fiction in general, is the stuff around the different segments of voters. And there's a slide deck that's shown on screen at one point about different made up, voter segments. But those slides look really credible. I mean, they look like the real slides look like for those sorts of presentations. So again, the idea of understanding who are the core voters you need to mobilize, who are the swing voters you need to win over. Good solid advice there, absolutely.
So they talk about Dominic Cummings' 4 fundamentals to win. Message, discipline, number 1. Build a broad coalition of voters, number 2. Have to say, I didn't really clock what 3 and 4 were. I don't know if you did.
No,
it wasn't really. I wasn't sure if it was one of those devices that just, had I missed it, or did it just fall off the radar a bit? Very quickly on some of the Facebook advertising, I think a lot of it is overblown, especially now, given we know people are scrolling less on Facebook. And again, we've just come out of local elections in Birmingham and just trying to think about how we use Facebook in those few. 2018, I think we maybe ran 1 ad. 2022, you might target people based on their particular interests. This election, there wasn't, I don't think, a huge amount of that at all. What it's essentially, it's almost more like digital door knocking. It's essentially you're posting stuff in local Facebook groups.
So yeah, one thing I think that also comes out as good advice, if you're thinking about, well, what's the lesson maybe from what I've seen in this drama, is the importance of having people who insulate a campaign from MPs. And, this in different forms. Again, most people who've been involved in running an election campaign have some story to tell about the completely mad thing the MP or the candidate or the party leader wanted to do. Just to be clear, I have no such stories about Ed Davey whatsoever, for the record, full stop. And therefore, what we get in this drama, which I think reflects reality, is the key role that Matthew Elliott played as a little bit of the Dominic Cummings human shield between him and other people, because not surprisingly, Dominic Cummings' style and approach and utter contempt for almost every other human being rubs a lot of people up the wrong way.
And actually, that's quite similar to No, isn't it? The campaign chairman there also does a similar job, yeah. Matthew Elliott, I think, says to Dominic Cummings, you should be the campaign manager because you need to be an attack dog. which I'm not quite sure about. Again,
Yeah.
I feel like we've talked enough on this episode about maybe it's not about genius campaign managers that win campaigns, and it's maybe other factors.
Oh, I don't know. I'm willing to buy that myth a little bit.
Apart from yourself, obviously, Mark. But there's a nice callback to sort of WhatsApp and about
Mm,
people being activated through WhatsApp. This is what I remember reading All Out War and seeing the role of Steve Baker and the ERG, particularly along some of the procedural things in Parliament about the referendum question. But I get the impression that this time is probably maybe the high point of political organising through WhatsApp. Whereas now the impression I get anyway, is that a lot of WhatsApps with lots of MPs now in are essentially designed so MPs can post it to leak to journalists.
yeah.
And I
But
think
there is definitely something about that WhatsApp culture has become such a dominant part of how politics and the media operate. And it's so sort of widespread and such a basic part of what people do that I think the degree to which it's revolutionized things is often underestimated. Yeah, no, I won't tell the story I was about to tell. Libel lawyers would possibly get involved.
well, that's good because we don't have any. In that case, I think we should move swiftly on to the Zeitgeist tape, where our lawyers won't need to get
The door,
involved.
the door, the door, the
I was
door, the
I was
door.
very pleased when I watched this and Mark hadn't watched it, and thinking, why have I made Mark relive one of the most traumatic experiences of his adult life? And then there was a door, Mark, wasn't there? Do you want to talk about the door?
I do indeed. So, new listeners may wonder why I'm getting excited about the door. It's because it's turned out there's a theme running through our episodes of important and prominent doors featuring in political drama. And this one absolutely has it. So, one of the really nice sort of conceits to visualize what we're meant to think about Dominic Cummings's brain and what's going on inside his head is him sitting in this very small little cupboard, sort of shutting the door on the outside world, inside this cupboard, and scribbling on the back of the door like Billio, like it's some whiteboard, coming up with all of this brilliant creative ideas. And again, this is partly why, in some ways, it felt like this is a drama written as it is by a playwright. You know, you could imagine doing that on stage in a play, and just that sense of the claustrophobia, the narrow space, cutting yourself off from the world, writing on the inside of the door so other people can't see it all captures so much that in a novel you would have to have quite a lot of descriptive narrative to cover. But the thing that distracted me from the door, and I wonder if you will find this massively implausible as well, did you notice what is in that little storage cupboard? On one side, they're stationery. On the other side, there is cleaning materials. Now, I have seen plenty of cupboards in offices with cleaning materials in them. I've seen plenty of cupboards in offices with stationery. For whatever reason, stationery and cleaning materials do not mix. You do not have them in the same storage location.
I hadn't thought about that since you mentioned it, because in your notes it just says, why does it have stationery in it? And my response was going to be, because it's a stationery cupboard, Mark.
Exactly.
And
And if it's a stationery cupboard, it shouldn't have cleaning material in it.
that's
Have I
true.
just led a weird life in which this hybrid stationery and cleaning material storage, that's normal for everyone else, but
It's
I've never
not,
noticed it?
it's not for me to judge how sheltered your experience of cupboards has been, Mark.
One of the other favorite little touches is the election countdown clock, which has become a little bit of a cliche, I think, in different political campaign offices, that you have a clock that's counting down. The Lib Dem HQ for the 2024 general election had a clock that was counting down. The version of events that I like to tell, our chief exec, if he's listening, may quibble over this, but, we're talking about Brexit, we'll be in tune with the topic if the facts aren't quite right, is that nobody knew how to set the clock. And so at various times, it was counting down to random other dates that quite often puzzled people when they were thinking, what is actually happening in 19 days' time? Why is it counting down 19 days' time? But having a countdown clock is a nice little touch. Again, that gives a sense of realism. Although one thing that turns out bizarrely weird if you watch this with the Amazon Prime subtitles. The Amazon Prime subtitles are not very good, but beautifully at one point the Hadron Collider is referred to, and on the subtitles it appears as the Hadrian Collider.
Well, Hadrian Collider, of course, was MP for Butte. So
Yes. What details did you spot that you loved?
I think probably the best scene in the film is the scene where Leave and Remain are talking about their key voters. So they're using that PowerPoint,
Mm,
but they're
yeah, yeah,
interspersing
yeah,
that
yeah.
between those members of those people at focus groups. And I think it does it really, really well. I imagine that different kinds of voters and how you segment the electorate and how you might target them is the kind of thing we find really interesting. But trying to make that as part of a mainstream show that quote unquote normal people might not fall asleep through, I think is quite hard. And I think they do it really, really well. You've mentioned James Graham's love of the Houses of Parliament
Mm,
and House of Commons and
mm,
read out the stuff in this House. And the House of Commons is shown several times, including one which felt symbolic where Dominic Cummings is looking at the House of Commons through a murky window
mm,
and you feel that's meant to be a little bit symbolic. And yeah, there's lots of good archive footage. You can have a lot of fun looking at the different politicians and celebrities who are there. So the ending is kind of interesting, isn't
mm.
it? Because the ending is the person from the ICO saying, "Are you done?" Dominic Cummings says, "We're all done." Except, of course, he wasn't because again, it's one of those things that's made it age curiously, isn't it? Is that
Mm.
Cummings wasn't done, returned to help Boris Johnson become PM, planned out the strategy. The rest is history.
Indeed. Oddly, that "we're all done" line, that final line, has sort of been through a bit of a roller coaster of how well that line has aged. So at the time it came out, I think a good final line. Then when Cummings is back as Boris Johnson's chief honcho, it's a line that hasn't aged so well. When then Cummings is ousted in controversy and crisis, it's a line that's aged rather. But it's a line that's sort of come and gone as
In 2030, when Nigel Farage is Prime Minister and Dominic Cummings is his chief strategist in number 10,
exactly.
it will have aged even worse. Well, a happy note to finish on.
Mm.
Last item on the agenda, state of play.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the appropriate noise, isn't
Yeah,
it?
I couldn't divorce myself enough from the real story, I think, to sufficiently rate this. I think the Dominic Cumberbatch is absolutely brilliant. As I've done with naming him, he sort of merges his character with reality in just a really good way, really great bit of acting. And there's lots of really good things about it, but fundamentally, because there's so much of the story of what actually happened that the drama doesn't capture. I think in the end, I gave it, just on our 0 to 650, clearly logically correct, but increasingly annoying scale to use. I thought just deserving of a majority, say 330 out of 650 to me. And looking at my notes, I'm about to curse you because you had a much better score to give it because you were the clever, smart person who got his calculator out, weren't you?
That's for us to judge, Mark. I think it's clear. But so I'm finding the 0 to 650 scale easier the more of these we do, because essentially I can go back to where you've carefully put
Mm,
in the spreadsheet what we've given each fiction and sort of put it between those.
yeah.
I did have quite high expectations because, as you said, it's written by James Graham. It's got Benedict Cumberbatch in it, but it didn't really meet them, to be honest. And I was a lot of it was quite irritating, not least the depiction that Cummings is this eccentric genius who won everything. It's quite similar to the Iron Lady. Really strong central performance.
Mm,
But if someone was to say to you, in the same way that the Iron Lady doesn't really, it's not the one film that captures Margaret Thatcher and why she was so
mm,
successful, why she fell. I don't think this. If someone was to say, say my niece when
mm.
she's older, if she gets interested in politics, like, would you show this to her so that she'd explain how Brexit happened? And you think, well, probably not actually.
Although if she said, "Oh, lovely uncle, I really want to watch this. Will you watch it with me and explain what's going on?" You wouldn't feel like it was going to be a chore, would you?
I would not. She might, but by the time we pause and get to the door knocking scene, she'll be regretting a number of life choices.
Because when you hit pause and say, "Let's just role play what canvassing really should be like."
But what's 52% of 650? And it turns out that's 338, which is my middle score for the Iron Lady. Well, it's better than the Iron Lady, so it gets 339.
52-48. very apposite.
Thank you very, very much for listening. If you want to keep in touch, we have a newsletter.
If you go to politicalfictions.substack.com, people can sign up to our email newsletter. You will get an email notification every time there's a new episode out. And we keep on promising, and eventually I will start delivering on some occasional bonus content on the email list as well.
What are we talking about next time?
We are talking about an Iranian football film, which is more political than it might sound. But if you're wondering, why is it political? Is it a film I want to watch? Subscribe now to the podcast or subscribe now to the email list and make sure you get notification when our episode is out. Exciting fact, it also contains me deploying some football knowledge.
I'm so excited.